Perfect.
Okay.
Where's the Phillies game?
Good for you. Have fun.
And yes, for all those in the Zoom, I'm going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, just drop them, and I will be able to ask on your behalf.
Okay, we're gonna get started. We're gonna talk about the appraisal contingency addendum and the price escalation addendum, right?
Yes.
So just by a show of hands, and those of you on Zoom, you know, there's no shaming here. How many, by a show of hands, what's the answer to my question? True or false? Can a buyer terminate the agreement of sale based on paragraph 8 of the mortgage contingency? Show of hands. Show of hands. Do you think they can? So if your buyer can't get a mortgage, can he terminate? Yes or no? True or false? You have to raise your hand one way or the other.
Yeah.
Trues? Falses. The answer is false. First of all, we all have to know what our contracts say. You're practicing real estate. You're responsible to know everything that says, right? Now, I'm not trying to be tough on you, but there is nothing in paragraph 8 that says buyer can terminate. Nothing. Think of the inspection contract, the inspection contingency. After the buyer has their inspections, in that number of days, they have 3 choices, right? Take it, leave it, or negotiate. But they can terminate based on inspections, because the agreement of sale says buyer can terminate. There is nothing in paragraph 8 that says the buyer can terminate. So you say to yourself, well, what if in good faith, I filled this out, it was $100,000 house, they're borrowing $95,000, it was a conventional loan. They had to get a 95% loan to value, it had to fall within an interest rate range here. Everything was good, they were pre-approved, but now my buyer lost their job. So what happens? In that situation, as long as there was no fraud and the buyer didn't lie on an application, it was just hard luck, the buyer lost their job. What you would do as the buyer's agent is get the rejection letter from the mortgage company and fill out a release of deposit monies, not a termination and release, the combined form. You all familiar with what I'm talking about? You don't fill out the combined form. You just get the release form. They're separate forms on par, and we put them together on one form because typically with a termination, you have to say what's going to happen with the money, right? So that's why we put termination and release on one form. But all you would fill out is the release form, and you would send it over to the listing agent along with a copy of the denial letter and a phone call to the listing agent. Pick up the phone and talk to each other, please. Don't text. Pick up the phone and call, and I would say, hey, Mike, unfortunately, my buyer lost his job, so we're under contract at 123 Main Street. I realize we're 3 days away from closing, but they lost their job. The mortgage company called their employer to do a verification of employment, and Amazon told them they've been terminated. Now, Mike has his house off the market for a month. I'm picking on Mike because he is knowledgeable. He's not such a knowledgeable agent. He's all mad because they had multiple offers. Ours was the best. He wants to keep the deposit. He has no right to keep the deposit. And if he doesn't want to give the deposit back, the transaction will go to closing. So now we're 3 days from closing. It would have to go to closing. The buyer doesn't show up. He's not in default because he had a mortgage contingency that says I'll only buy if I qualify for a mortgage. I don't. I'm not in default. You can't keep my deposit. Now, if we were a month away from closing, it would behoove Mike as the listing agent to sign the release, give the money back so they can get the house back on the market. If Mike wants to be stubborn and not give the money back, now we're waiting a month, we're going to closing, my buyer's not showing up, and they have to give the money back. Now, he could fight and not sign, brokers can't give the money back until the release is signed by both parties. But all they'd have to do is file mediation and they'd have no grounds to keep the buyer's money. So they either spend $400 to go through mediation. So you cannot fill out a termination and release and quote paragraph 8 as the termination reason. There's nothing in the contract that says the buyer can terminate. So again, it would go to closing, the buyer doesn't show up, he's not in default, they would get their money back then. Okay, is that concept clear to everybody? Now, you filled this out. We're gonna use that same example throughout this whole discussion. You have $100,000 sale price, your buyer's putting down 5%, so their loan is $95,000. That would go in the loan amount. The term's 30 years, whatever, 15 years, type of mortgage, conventional. Loan, this is the loan to value 95 over 100 equals what percent?
Recording in progress.
Come on, everybody, basic elementary math. 95 divided by 100 is what percent? Oh my gosh, folks, come on, 95%. Your loan to value is 95%, that would go here. Now, the house appraises for 98,000. Okay? I can't do this in my head, but I know how to do the calculation.
25% of 98.
Right. Now, my loan to value is 96.9%. Does 96.9 exceed 95?
Yeah.
What does this say? Loan for conventional loans, loan to value is not to exceed, and you put 95 there. Now you had an appraisal and the loan to the new value, the appraised value is only 96.9%. So now your mortgage contingency didn't work. Can the buyer terminate? Absolutely not. Absolutely not, because paragraph 8 doesn't give him the option to. So if they can't come up with the money, or you can't negotiate with the seller, you're protected, but you're not gonna get your money back until when? I just told you 5 minutes ago. Closing. Unless you attached, go to page 14 of this. If you attach an appraisal contingency addendum to the agreement of sale. So if you checked the block, appraisal contingency addendum, now it didn't appraise. And this addendum says, if the house doesn't appraise and the buyer and seller can't come to terms on a new purchase price, buyer can terminate and get their money back. So if you want the buyer to be able to terminate around the mortgage process, you would have to do an appraisal contingency addendum. So what is the pros of doing that? You get your buyer their money back right away when it doesn't appraise. What's the negative of doing that? Now you're in a competing offer situation and somebody waived an appraisal and you didn't, but you have to go on what your buyer's comfortable with to know whether you should protect them or run the risk of waiting till closing and not having to get into mediation to get their money back. But you cannot terminate based on paragraph 8. So I encourage all of you today, or sometime in the next couple of days, read paragraph 8 thoroughly. Okay, so does that all make sense? Because we have to start there, I think, before we can get into the appraisal contingency addendum. So is everybody clear on how you fill out the mortgage thing? One other practice tip that I do, on the mortgage,
Repeat the back.
yeah, please, thank you. You're like Vanna White over there, turning the letters.
Just nobody look while I'm scrolling. There we go.
A tip that I do here, where are interest rates now?
6.9.
Right. Let's say adjustable rates are 4.5. Right, so follow me on this. when I do type of mortgage, this was a conventional mortgage, $100,000 sale price, putting 5% down. They have $5,000 they're gonna put down. They're gonna borrow the other 95,000, that's their loan. That's a conventional loan. When I write here type of mortgage, I write conventional dash fixed rate only. Because if I put 6.5 to 7.5 here, a seller, and I put just conventional here, a seller could say, well, rates went up to 8%. So it exceeded my maximum, but you can get an ARM for 6.6. Now you're in that range again. And I don't want a seller to force my buyer to get an ARM. Is everybody following you?
Question from the chat.
So fixed rate only, conventional fixed rate only, so you're not forced into having your buyer in this high interest rate environment take an ARM to meet the interest rate range that you put in there. Go ahead.
Somebody from the chat said, so the mortgage contingency box is to disclose the terms of the mortgage the buyer is looking to obtain to the seller more than it is a protection to get out.
It's still a contingency, because if they lose their job, they said our purchase is contingent upon us getting a mortgage, we can't. So it becomes the reason why they're not in default.
That makes sense.
It's both.
So it is a contingency, our purchase is contingent on our ability to get a mortgage. But when they're denied a mortgage or can't get a mortgage, you can't, there's nothing in the paragraph that says the buyer can, you can't use it as a termination reason. You can just ask for the release of the deposit money in the hopes that the seller will give it to you, and they should, because if you can't get a mortgage and you show up at closing, the buyer is not in default. So the seller can only keep deposit if the buyer's in default. This buyer is not in default when they've tried and cannot get the mortgage, as long as this paragraph was elected. I know it's not as clear as you'd like it to be, but it all makes logical sense. And this is where we get tripped up because we don't understand the mechanics of it. I really want to teach the mechanics of how this all works so you can always remember it, whatever you put in there. So if you want to protect your buyer when the house doesn't appraise, then use an appraisal contingency addendum, because that addendum, if you can pull that up now, please, the appraisal contingency addendum, that addendum does say the buyer can terminate if the house doesn't appraise. But again, in the competitive situation that we're in, when you add an appraisal contingency, your offer is a little less strong, but it doesn't matter. You have to go with what your buyer wants and what they're comfortable with. So if the best way to look at this form, option one is just our old appraisal contingency addendum. Option one is not used when you're trying to cover the gap. Option one is the basic old-fashioned appraisal contingency addendum that said, if the house doesn't appraise, so if you were using it to protect this situation where you bought for 100 and it only appraised for 98, you would say the house must appraise for $100,000. And if it's not satisfied, the buyer will deliver a copy of the appraisal report to the seller. And the buyer will either terminate the agreement, right there gives the buyer the power to terminate the agreement. So now you can use the appraisal contingency addendum as your termination reason. The buyer will terminate or enter into a mutually acceptable written agreement with the seller. So if the seller says, okay, we're gonna do a change in terms and change the purchase price to $98,000, now you're moving forward. The buyer's not terminating because they entered into a mutually acceptable written agreement in the seller. And if they don't terminate and they don't enter into a mutually acceptable written agreement, within the 30 days, the buyer has to buy the house at $100,000. So we're responsible to make sure that this is getting done in a timely manner, that the appraisal gets done in a timely manner. It's just like the home inspection. If they don't give us the report in 10 days, 14 days, 7 days, they're buying it as is. Same thing, okay?
I love
So-
that you said option one is the old appraisal again.
Yeah, option one, just think of this as if I need an appraisal addendum, this is what I use, period. Go ahead.
May I ask a question? Because, okay, so the purpose of this, would you say, is to protect their deposit and gives them the right to terminate?
Exactly.
Okay.
It gives the termination right and the right to the money back. Because it says here, terminate the agreement with all deposit monies returned to the buyer.
Okay, so when we fill out the box, say 95 to 100, and we don't have this,
Right. And it
And-
doesn't appraise.
it doesn't appraise, they're at risk of losing their deposit.
No, they'll get it back, but they have to wait till settlement to get it back. Because they're not in default, because they had the terms. We did not, the 95 was exceeded, because the reality is we're at 96.9. So they're appraised, the mortgage contingency protects them.
Okay,
They still don't have to go through. If we don't come to terms and you didn't have an appraisal contingency addendum, the seller still can't keep their money. It's when they'll get their money back. So settlement will come and the buyer's not in default. So now by settlement, the seller has to give them their money back.
okay, so if it.
This gives them their money back sooner.
Okay, so if we don't have that, because we know what type of market it is, and we're on this situation and it doesn't appraise, what would be the next step that I would?
It doesn't appraise. I would send the appraisal to the listing agent and I would say, we will buy it. If you'll sell it to us at 98, seller says no.
Right.
Then you send over a release of deposit monies asking for the money back. If the seller doesn't sign it, now you're stuck waiting till closing. Your buyer doesn't show up at closing, but they had a mortgage contingency clause that says they're no longer in default. So if they're not in default, the seller can't keep their money. Will you still have to fight for the money? Probably. But think about it. In this market, what seller, when they can't come to terms, you're as a listing agent gonna say, give them their money back and
Yeah.
let's get this on the market.
Right.
Get rolling, but do not fill out a termination and release form and use paragraph 8. It's happening today because the listing agent doesn't have a clue and the buyer's agent doesn't have a clue. And you say we're terminating based on the mortgage contingency and everybody signs it and brokers sign it and nobody's any of the wiser, but it's not correct.
Okay,
You have no right under paragraph 8 to terminate. There's nothing in that paragraph that says you can
It's just in everybody's best interest. If they
to
can come
release the money. The release says everybody's releasing each other from the agreement of sale and, you can all move on.
okay, thank you, I
So
appreciate
you
it.
want the release, not the termination and release. When you have home inspections, you can terminate based on the inspection paragraph. So you do need the termination and release form together, but they're separate forms in par. You don't need to terminate. Did
It
you?
is actually two different forms or just the bottom half of the one form.
They're separate forms. They each have their own, they're separate and they're together on one for a convenience of when you can terminate and ask for the money back. And remember, terminating party is only one signature. You don't need both people to terminate, just one party to terminate for the agreement of sale. Now, the infamous appraisal contingency addendum to cover the give it some agreement.
Oh, yeah, take it, right?
So when you want to use it for GAAP. And we'll do that next. Let me get through this though, before we answer any questions, because I think once you see it, I may answer some of your questions. Because there is one, we're gonna do a basic example. So the house is listed for $400,000. You're in a competing offer. Your buyer's willing to pay $450,000 for the house as long as the house appraises for 410. So if the appraisal hits 410 or higher, you'll give the seller $450,000. So this was the list price. This is the purchase price on the contract. What's your gap? 40,000. the appraised value of the property must be equal to or higher than the purchase price, or what would you put in there?
410.
410. As long as it appraises for 410. The buyer will buy the house at the purchase price. So when you're doing GAAP, you only initial option 2. Option 2 is designed for GAAP appraisal. You do not complete option 1, otherwise you're saying it has to appraise at the purchase price, or they can terminate. So if you put this up here and select option 1, it says they can terminate. You don't want to tell the seller that you're terminating. You're telling the seller that if I can get an appraisal at 410. Now, if you can scroll down, Dana, there you go, right here. If the terms of paragraph 1 aren't satisfied, we appraised at 405. You go back to the financing paragraph in the mortgage contingency, that prevails now. Which means it didn't appraise. You put a loan to value percentage in there. Now everything's up for negotiation. This form is out of play because it says if the terms of paragraph 1, which was where we put the 410, are not satisfied, you go back to paragraph 8. Well, what did we just learn from paragraph 8? If it didn't appraise and you can't negotiate, you go to settlement, you know. The problem is nobody understands the mechanics and everybody wants to hold the money because people get pissed off, and for the waste of my time, having my house off the market, I want money. Well, you have to be explaining to your sellers up front. Very seldom can we ever keep this buyer's deposit, just so you know. The contract protects the buyer and their deposit more than it protects the seller. The buyer just has to whimsically say, I'm done, I don't want to buy this house anymore, inspections are done, appraisal's done, we're 2 weeks from closing and I don't want to buy the house anymore. What's the only other out in a contract that a buyer could potentially have to get their money back? There is one other secret out for a buyer. It's not very secret, that you should close up, a gap that you should close immediately when you're in this situation. What can the buyer terminate until they receive something and for 5 days thereafter? HOA documents. If everything was done, appraisal's done, you had a listing that was on the market for 2 years, you finally sold it, it's in a community, the appraisals are done, the inspections are done. The buyer's agent calls you and says, we want our $50,000 back. Well, you can't, we have no contingencies. Oh, but we do. We're in an HOA and you never gave me a resale certificate. I want my money back. The contract clearly says in the HOA paragraph that until the buyer gets those and for 5 days thereafter, they can terminate the agreement of sale and get their money back. And it's happened. And it's blindsided the listing agent. And you have a fiduciary duty to the seller to make sure that you're managing the contract. So now, when your seller has to give up that $50,000, you will be sued probably if you have an angry seller, especially if your house has been on the market for 2 years. Okay, so don't forget to get HOA resales. It's not just giving the buyer's agent the documents. If you're a buyer's agent, don't sign a receipt of documents just for the documents. You need that resale certificate because that's what tells the buyer the budget. Is there enough money? Maybe they want to see that it's a financially strong community. So the resale certificate contains the budget. It contains if there's any assessments against the community, those kinds of things. So it's not just giving the buyer the documents, it's giving them the resale certificate. And make sure that as a buyer's agent, you get the budget and the current income statement to see how much money they have. So when you're doing a gap, you use option 2 only and put the minimum appraised value. Now, that's all clear. That was pretty basic. Now, what do you do when you're competing and you have a price escalation addendum and you're saying that you'll pay $1,000 over the highest offer they get, up to $450, and my buyers will do a $40,000 gap. So now you're escalating, and you don't know that you won at $450. So you don't know what number to put, because what happens if they'll pay a $40,000 gap and you only had to go to $440? Now, it only has to appraise at 400. Here you won the offer. So you knew to put 410 in paragraph 1. Here, you're competing and you have a PEA out there going up to 450. And you don't want to put 410 in here if you're only escalating to 440. You're gonna, but you don't know to put 400 in there. So what do? You pick up the phone and you call the agent and you say, I'm gonna write up here for now that buyer, can you scroll down just a little bit? 40,000 less than agreed upon purchase price. And call the agent and say, Julie, this is where I'm telling you in a form. But once we come to a final price, if we win, we're gonna put the real number in here and it becomes a counter offer that everybody signs, just like all the changes in the contract have to be signed. Now my appraisal contingency addendum has to be initialed and changed for a real number to be there. But you can still use it by picking up the phone and calling them and putting it in your cover email. We'll pay $40,000 less and we'll memorialize that when we do the final paperwork. Because this is the question I always get, well, how do I know what number to put here? Talk to people. After a counter, and when you have escalation and you have 17 offers on a property, you're always changing some form anyway, right? Something's getting crossed off. I don't even use or initial a price escalation addendum. I submit it. And, or when I'm a listing agent, I get them. And then I cross it off. And I change the purchase price on the contract, because even though it says at the bottom of the price escalation addendum, this is valid. What if the listing agent or the buyer's agent doesn't send the full documents to the lender, and the lender has a contract with, you started at 400 and you ended up at 440. Now the appraiser thinks he has to hit 400. So don't execute the price escalation addendum. Use it to figure out where you're gonna be, and then change the purchase price on the contract. Change the mortgage amount on the contract. Change the amount on the price escalation addendum to be the $40,000 gap, or whatever the buyer's agent told you the gap was. Change all your forms as your final completed offer. Use what was submitted, the PEA and the ACA, to negotiate. And when an agent says, a listing agent says, I do not want any PEAs, highest and best offer, it is illegal in the state of Pennsylvania not to present to your client every paper that was given to you as part of the offer. So agents that don't like them because they can't understand them, that is not legal, but you're pushing an elephant uphill if you try to convince the agent. So we know the rules. If we're competing, we wanna, and you're dealing with a not so bright listing agent, you gotta kind of dumb yourself down to their level if you want your buyer to win and do what they say. You can try to educate them that these are valid forms to submit with an offer and they have to present them. Unless their seller in writing told them, don't give me any PEAs. Do you think a seller out there knows what a PEA is? Unless their agent said, we're not gonna deal with these. Right, exactly. So you're the one instructing your seller to just ask for highest and best, because you don't wanna go through figuring out how do these work to know when I'm in a competing offer. Just look at your highest one and see who will come close to that. Anybody whose PEA is under the highest amount listed on the PEA, those offers are off the table. It's simple. You don't have to say, well, they're going up 1,000 and then, just look at your highest one. And then who came close to that? And then the one that had the highest one goes their increment, over the next highest. We can talk about that form too. But my point of the ACA is this is your gap appraisal form, only option 2. Option 1, as Brittany said, is the old fashioned, the original, I shouldn't say old fashioned, the original appraisal contingency. This is used for your gap. If you know your gap, put the price in. If you don't, it's fine to say 40K less than final agreed upon price purchase price, to be determined or something. But just be responsible to know that this form can't have words in it, it's gotta have a number, but you're using the form to communicate what your buyer's willing to do. And you've made the phone call, you picked up the phone instead of texted, and you put it in your cover email that when you sent the offer over. So you've talked to people. So when you don't know what number to put in, this is my recommendation, and that's the world according to Gary. Nobody, I don't know that this is right or wrong, but the bottom line is, before this is executed by all parties, a true number is up there, or language was crossed off and a number was put in and everybody initial and dated it, okay? Does that make sense? Do we have any questions in the chat?
No questions.
Okay. Is that what was confusing people with the price escalation addendum? Never, ever do you use it as option one when you're dealing with a gap, only option two. It is a difficult form, there's no question. And you don't want to use companies' generic gap forms. Because there are several companies out there who have a different form for this. Put it on here if you're the listing agent. This protects both parties more. Unfortunately, you may have to educate the buyer's agent why you didn't use their gap form.
What I've noticed on those other companies' gap forms is they don't often have language around who can terminate and how deposit monies are given back, if at all. So that's typically what because I've had a
Yes.
couple agents say, hey, can Keller Williams have one of these typed up?
No,
And that's.
we
the
don't
issue.
need to.
Right, that's the
Right.
issue, is they don't have the
Yes,
language that this has that protects your buyer.
and that's an excellent point. That you don't, when PAR has a form, lawyers did this. That doesn't mean that the company that's giving you the gap, their lawyer didn't do it, but does their lawyer practice real estate all the time? So you want to use the PAR form for sure, because it just does protect everybody a little better. So, the only place, like I said, that it gets a little bit sticky is when you don't know what number to put in there. Make a phone call, put it in your email, write this language, and just before your buyer signs it, make sure there's a number in there. Any other questions on the appraisal contingency addendum? So use it when your buyer wants to terminate based on an appraisal option one, and option two is the gap. Okay, so we were gonna do,
Price escalation.
okay. While I'm doing this, a couple of tips with deposit monies. Make sure that you're getting a decent deposit on your offers, because if you're taking a low deposit and you've allowed the box to be checked that says seller is limiting to keeping the deposit as liquidating damages, you could be liable to your seller if they didn't understand that you've limited them on what they can keep. You want to make sure your seller's fine that if the buyer would walk, that's enough for them to keep. So, I heard Brittany use the words earlier about our, and it's our mission here about win-win. I always let the buyer make the final decision, but if you write an offer on my listing and you give me $1,000 and you check the box, I call you back and I say 5,000 and you can check the box. If they only want to give me 1,000, you can't check the box. So go back to the buyer and find out what they want. But 5,000, the box can be checked. 1,000, the box is left blank. Now, will the seller ever sue for the full amount of the purchase price? Probably not, but does the buyer know that? And can the buyer be assured of that? No, and that box is not checked. And believe me, you'll get the 5,000 because the buyer wants the box checked. And you have a fiduciary duty to your seller to make sure you're not allowing them to sign a contract where all they get out of it is $1,000. So your seller can actually come after you for not knowing to have protected them. So you could be liable to your seller. So keep that in mind with deposits, since we were talking about deposits. Okay, this addendum is part of the agreement of sale. Make sure that if you're including this is a huge piece in competitive offers. This is not automatically printed on page 14 of the agreement of sale. So if you're including a price escalation addendum, make sure you check the extra lines there and write in price escalation addendum, par form PEA. I had a house in Hummelstown, some of you may have even written on it, I could have had 30 offers, I stopped at I let people call me, if you call me and I have multiple offers, I'll say, what are you gonna write? If I have more than that in hand, don't waste your time, like, I'm not gonna make you go through. Now, some agents won't do that because they wanna show their seller they got them a ton of offers. Or they think that the agent's fishing. Well, I don't care if you're fishing and you'll write me more, great that you fish, because now I got even more from you, so it doesn't matter. But anyway, a newer agent in our office submitted, so I had 17, so I'm going through all of them, trying to put them on a spreadsheet. The first document I looked at was all of the agreements of sale, and if they had a PEA checked. So after I had everything summarized, I had another agent go through my spreadsheet with me, and I said, here's the spreadsheet, you edit the audit the spreadsheet. I'm gonna go through all these emails, and I'm gonna tell you I'm gonna go through the emails one more time. Well, one of our agents didn't indicate on the agreement of sale that an addendum was attached. So legally, a contract is a contract and the attachments have to be referenced on the contract for them to be legally binding. So any addendum has to be noted so that it's all part of one agreement. That's just a legal concept of addendums and contracts. His offer was at purchase price and that's all I had on the spreadsheet. His offer escalated up to $45,000 over asking price. And had I not checked the second time, I would have lost money for my seller. Now, somebody did go higher than him. So he went to $395, they went to $410 in $2,000 increments. So my seller ended up at $397. But I figured I would have lost the seller about $5,000 at an agent's mistake. And he could have cost his buyer the sale if he would have been the highest, because he didn't reference it. So make it easy for the listing agent when you're competing. Give them everything you can in that summary email. It's a shame Shanice left. When she submits an offer, she does a really nice cover letter on her offers, and it spells everything out. And feed the listing agent what you want them to know. I feed them what I want them to parrot to their seller. Do not give them personal information about your buyer. So that's giving people information to violate fair housing, and you all know that. So no love letters, don't be caught up in that craziness.
Can you use that escalation if it wasn't attached as part of the contract?
Well, yes, because I knew that was his intention. But I don't use them anyway, I changed the purchase
Right,
price.
but can you use it as your counter? to-
Yeah, well, we count, yes, so because I had that, I was able to send it to, as proof to the agent, because even though I don't use the escalation clauses, I technically am not obligated to tell the other agent why I'm escalating their offer, but I'm going to. So they know I'm not just making stuff up, because let's face it, an escalation is putting your cards on the table as a buyer. I mean, you're showing your cards, but you have to because the seller's in control in this market. So I sent that escalation clause to the other agent showing that I had an escalation up to $395. They would agree to go 2,000 more up to $410. So that's how they got to $397. So I did send that over to him. Not the contract, because I wasn't obligated to, but I said, and it was fully executed. I did cross off the names, but you could see the DocuSign logo at the top, which you can't, I mean, I guess you could fabricate that, but who's gonna go to that kind of trouble?
So you did say they don't have to provide that to you.
If you're not gonna use it, if you're not executing it, technically if this is what says I have to provide a copy. But if I'm not using this form, then technically nothing in the contract says I have to, but why wouldn't you? You have to remember to do the right thing. Do unto others as you
Yeah,
want
yeah.
done unto you.
But
It's in the code of ethics, so it's ethical to do it. And if you,
Like my ask for it?
yes, yes,
And I would.
Yeah.
and I would.
Yeah.
Here's the other thing. What if you're competing with The reason you wanna see that other offer, and especially if it's contingent upon, if you're taking an offer contingent upon the settlement of another home. What if that other home is contingent upon the settlement of another home? And now you're three in a domino deal. You may not wanna do that. I mean, we're not taking those kind of offers anymore, but in the day, 31 years ago, contingent upon the settlement of someone's house was extremely typical. Now you wouldn't even look at the offer.
I know.
But I mean, even when you started, we did settlement contingency.
Oh, all the time. You could do sale and settlement contingencies with seller help.
Yeah.
And that was a good deal.
Yeah, and the house wasn't even on, the buyer's house wasn't even on the market.
Right,
Right,
right.
yeah, I mean, so if the market changes. Go ahead.
So the quandary that's out there, I believe, is, so I send you an offer on Thursday with an expired date of Friday. And all of a sudden you decide, or your seller decides, all offers are due on Monday. Mine just expired. And
So you have the choice. Is it, I would call you and say, Julie, yours is expired.
right,
Do they still wanna offer, or we'll just, yours is not, yours doesn't exist?
where I was going with that is that a lot of agents will still use an expired. My understanding is they can't use it once it expires unless we continue it, unless we say, yeah, we're gonna change the date. But if we don't, like I had one out over this weekend. And I'm like, don't use mine as an escalation, because we're done. It expired on Friday.
Yeah, if you told him you're done, he can't use that, but
Right,
if you send out to everybody that your date is Monday and no agent calls you, then you're left to assume you have a good offer, they're still in the game. Unless they tell you they're not in the game. That's a difficult thing.
that is.
But if I send that expired contract to you as a buyer's agent and your people still sign the final contract, they're locked in. So if the buyer's agent was fine with that, it doesn't matter.
So we don't, okay, so,
So it's up to the buyer's agents of those contracts to say, my people know, they're gonna put that date in there to
Right.
get a quick response to try to force the seller's hand. But they all know that if the seller doesn't respond.
Right.
And you didn't tell me, because even if we sign after that date.
Right.
As long as everybody moves forward, it doesn't matter. You can't go back and say, but it was an invalid contract to begin with. That's a legal concept called, I think it's called, don't quote me on this, estoppel, that you can't go, your actions can't move forward. And then when something goes awry, you come back and say, but we didn't even have a valid contract to start. So if everybody signed it a day after the acceptance date, and you still gave me your buyer's deposit,
Right.
and I put it in the escrow account, your actions and seller's actions all moved forward. You can't go back and say, wait, we didn't even have a valid contract.
so I guess there was an email, I was under the impression that if I gave it to you on Thursday, expired on Friday, and all of a sudden a deadline was set, then I have to say, I have to extend it, or tell you something that it's extended.
But nowhere it is, yeah, and I think that it's assumed that if you don't do anything, you didn't cancel, so I assume you're still good. Versus, you're not good unless you tell me, so it's how you wanna view that.
Hmm.
And
Well, he said-
it's a valid point, but, that's where we don't wanna communicate with each other anymore. Pick up the phone and protect your buyer and say, if you don't sign mine today, we're done. Mr. Listing Agent, you can't use mine to escalate. You have control of that offer till it's signed as the buyer's agent. And it's up to you to instruct the listing agent what you want done with your offer. Not him or her to come back to you. I mean, I'm not saying you emphatically,
right.
but you know, that they would go back to the buyer's agent.
A question for you on that, back to the termination thing. By the way, I think that term is estoppel,
Best offer,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what.
but the, termination, 3 days before settlement, the lender sends out an email, we're not able to settle, the buyer never paid for the appraisal.
Oh, wait, that's different than the buyer terminating.
Right, well, they sent, the buyer sent a termination notice.
Okay.
With the return of funds, and of course, the seller didn't want to sign, and seller sent their own termination, actually, they saw this coming, they sent the termination out. It never settled. Okay, waited the 3 more days, and then the date the settle was over. No one's signing the termination. Buyer won't sign the release of funds.
Right,
After the default 180 days that's in there, what happens to those funds?
they have to go back to the buyer. Unless the seller filed a minimum of mediation or litigation.
Okay.
Before it said, we added the words mediation, which you can do in a phone call. I would never let anybody change the 180 days because it takes that long to maybe get litigation. But, if you go to the, oh, sorry.
Let me go to you.
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah, please.
it's right there, the deposit, when you notice inside the contractors, the days, it's a default 180.
180 unless mediation or litigation was filed and the broker holding the money gets proof of that, then the clock stops.
Okay.
Till the mediation is filed,
But the default, it goes back to the buyer.
goes back to the buyer.
Gotcha.
Now, there's also a paragraph in the more, and there's a paragraph that the buyer in good faith has to do things and pay for the appraisal and pay for fees. A buyer has to understand when you're working with them that you are ready, you're buying a house and you could spend money and get nothing. So these buyer's agents that want to wait till inspections are over, till the buyer pays for the appraisal, you're kind of jeopardizing your mortgage contingency when you do that. Because it clearly says you've got to pay all fees, you know, things are happening simultaneously, and that's just where you have to, in your initial buyer interview, say, if you get the house, things are gonna happen simultaneously. The bank's gonna want money, but yet you haven't had your home inspection, which you know you can get out on. Well, just as you spent inspection money to get reports that you're gonna use to terminate, you've also spent money with the mortgage and you may get nothing for that. But that's life. That's
It's
just the
cost
way.
money to file for mediation.
Yes, yes, it does.
A few $100 or something.
Several $100s. I think it's, the default paragraph, I think it's paragraph, it's, Would you know my-
I'm so sorry.
That's great.
Another nickel in it. There it goes.
Good.
And they don't call you and say, oh, it's out. Like you're assuming they're okay with that.
Well, the 16 is what I was telling you. This is what I want to point out. So go to 16, just go up a little bit. When you're in a homeowners association, now scroll down. C3, write this down to read this. The act provides that the buyer may declare this agreement void at any time before the buyer receives the association documents and for 5 days thereafter, or settlement, whichever comes first. So if settlement's only 3 days, they only have 3 days to look at the document. Buyer's notice to the seller must be in writing, and all deposit monies will be returned to the buyer. The buyer. That's an out for every buyer buying in a homeowners association or a condo, if they want out. So when you're selling in those, just as you lock up the inspections, you lock this up as fast as possible, because that's an out for every buyer. Let me see, keep going down a little bit. The default. Default 26. 26, yeah, so 180 days unless the broker is in receipt of verifiable written notice that a dispute subject to litigation or mediation. So once the buyer would file mediation and get a form from the association and mediation is filed, and you gave that to the listing broker, that clock would stop and the listing broker cannot give that money back until that's resolved. So by court order, a broker has to give it back. If a buyer and seller both agree on the release form, the broker has to give it back. But if only one party will sign and the other party won't, and you went to mediation, then that could be tied up for months. But once settlement comes and goes, the seller can put the house back on the market. The beautiful thing about signing that release is the seller can get going with the house again. And in this market, why wouldn't they want to? So it's kind of our jobs to de-escalate when people are angry because, damn it, I had my house off the market and I want their money. Well, contractually, you don't have all the time the right to their money. Even though you think you should, the seller doesn't in most cases. And you really want to try to convince them, you know, I know it stings and it sucks and it's horrible, but let's just move on. Let's just, move on.
Settlement date has long expired.
Yeah,
It can go back on the market, even if there's a dispute over.
sure. Yeah. Once settlement date is,
Right.
because they could show up in settlement with cash. So if you're a listing agent, you gotta be careful putting it back on the market before settlement date.
Here, I gotta go.
That's
I
fine.
just wanna say thanks for.
Oh, sure, anytime, just call if you have questions. So on the price escalation addendum, we should get back to that, sorry.
No, that was very helpful, and I think, you know, I'll just add there, like, for me personally, that's why it's so important to me to use either an attorney or a title company that has a great attorney that backs it.
Yes,
Because stuff does happen, and I know Jim Hughes has helped me a ton with being able to talk to my client and kind of talk them off the ledge of, listen, this isn't gonna be worse litigation, because you're gonna pay an attorney more money to try to get this deposit back or what have you, but it's just so helpful because when people are buying and selling real estate, they get emotional, and then sometimes it's not about the money, even though they're fighting over money, to them it's the principle. And that can get expensive, so,
especially when you have an attorney involved, you're absolutely right.
yeah.
So this is basically saying you'll increase the net purchase price, so that's a key term in the price escalation addendum, net purchase price. This is a question I always get, so net purchase price is nothing more, it's very simple, keep it simple. Net purchase price, if I wrote an offer for $100,000 and I asked the seller for seller's assistance. Seller assist of $3,000, then net purchase price to my seller is $97,000. Everybody get that math? Okay. So the listing agent for this offer is worth, so if the listing agent gets $200,000 offers, and the second one had a PEA saying, I'll pay $1,000 more than the highest offer up to, so this was their purchase price. This was the purchase price. And this one has a PEA saying, I'll pay $1,000 up to 110. And these are your two offers. This is offer one, and this is offer two. What offer wins, and what's the final purchase price of the winning offer?
Offer to $100,000.
Right. Offer two didn't have to escalate, because their purchase price is already higher than the net purchase price of the other offer. Now what if offer two said, I want $2,000 in seller's assist? What offer wins and for how much? What's the net of offer two? Does 98 beat 97? So they win it for 98. The price escalation doesn't even come into play in this situation. That's how you have to think about this stuff. So now, same situation. I don't know why you do this, so this is kind of bizarre, but let's say offer one says, I'll pay both sides of the transfer tax. Now, which offer wins and for how much? So this is still 2,000, this is 3,000. They'll pay both sides of the transfer tax. Which one wins?
Still offer to, taxes aren't part of your purchase price.
Taxes are not part of the calculation. Thank you, Julie. That is not, has nothing to do with that purchase price. If this said no closing costs and this said no closing costs, and this, so this is still 1,000 more up to 110. But this one's paying both sides of the transfer tax. Who wins and for how much?
It ends at the same amount, so.
Option two, don't let the transfer tax fool you. They're the same, he'll go $1,000 more, offer two gets it for 101,000, period. Now, if you do a seller's cost sheet and this offer nets them more because of the 2,000, it may net them more, and that's the offer you want to take. But when it comes to determining what the purchase price is, you cannot consider the payment of the transfer tax. You consider it when you're calculating the net of each offer to a seller. But I can't, if they paid if they pay $2,000, you can't say, well, this is like getting $102,000 offer, so you gotta give me 103. No, you can't use transfer tax when you're countering purchase price. It comes into play when you're figuring out what nets the seller more, and they certainly wanna take the offer that nets them more. But you can't consider it when you're revising what the purchase price of the new offer has to be.
Now, you can counter any offer.
You can counter any offer at anything,
So-
exactly, but just sticking with the facts of the form, net purchase price does not consider transfer tax, but you're right, you can counter anything. And that's the reason why these escalation clauses are great for the seller, because the buyer is putting their cards out there. I could get 5 escalation, if this one would have said, I'll escalate to 110 in $1,000 increments, I could counter, give me 110. Well, I only said I would do that if you had competing offers. Well, I'm throwing the escalation clauses out. Will you give me 100? If you give me 110, I'll stay at the house. Now, what can the buyer say? No. But everything's negotiable. You can't, a buyer's agent can't tell you, you can't counter me at this because I only told you we would go that high if we were competing. Well, you kind of put your cards out there, and I can, as Julie said, you can counter anything. So,
So if transfer tax doesn't count towards the escalation, what about if the buyer offers seller closing cost help?
the buyer offers selling closing cost help
To win the offer, if it's like super competitive.
other than paying the transfer tax?
Like if they
Like
were,
paying their buyer's commission. But there again, you can't force the listing agent to, they have a listing contract that says they'll, since we're all in the same, are you, is everybody for Keller?
Yeah.
Is everybody watching Keller?
yeah,
So if you have a 6% listing contract, you can't force me to give the 3% I was giving to you back to my seller. I had a listing contract with that seller. So if the buyer's agent tries to be tricky and say, the buyer will pay me my 3%. The listing agent better have an attorney write language in the contract that says, and the seller will receive the 3% that was coming to the buyer's agent as part of their net proceeds. Because you can't alter another agent's contract with their seller. I'm under contract with Julie to sell her house for 6%, period. We signed a contract, I get her house to closing, I get 6%. Just because you didn't want your 3, doesn't mean I have to give your 3 back to her.
so if you
I have
want,
a contract with a seller to pay 6% to move this Kleenex box. I moved it, give me my money. I told you in the multi-list, if you move it, I'll give you 3. You're saying, I don't want my 3. Okay, thanks. Right here. Now, I would never do that because I know what your intention is, but you have to remember, you're not in a contract with Julie. I am.
Well, in that scenario, what would you, because your contract with the seller says that you're giving X
You're gonna
percent
co-broke.
to the buyer anyway.
Well, no,
buyer's
it says, it says that that's how you'll split it if, but you wouldn't have to. It doesn't say I have to give it back to you. It doesn't say if she doesn't want it, it comes back to you. The contract, the listing contract doesn't say that.
yeah, so you gotta make sure your agreement of sales specifies where you want.
where
to
that
be
money is coming
applied.
from
Where to be applied.
and who it's to go to.
Exactly.
Yes, yes.
That's one of those, like you're.
My point
gonna do
of
that.
being a devil's advocate with you on that is, don't think because you do that, you can control the listing agent's behavior and it's gonna end up in the seller's pocket to make your offer win. You didn't say that. You assumed that by saying you don't want your co-broke. Remember, co-broke is between brokers. Now, I can't get into it too much, but all this is gonna change after August with the new forms, because the agreement of sale is gonna pretty much, and cooperating broker forms are gonna become very important come August 17th. So that will change a little bit. But you can't assume that tactic
Okay.
will work. I don't know of any well, I do know of listing agents out there who would not give that back to their seller.
I would-
This has come up a lot.
We have seen it on closing, this
Yeah.
one, so like, we have seen it recently.
And that is not unethical, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can't, my contract is with the seller. You, Mr. or Miss Buyer's agent, can't tell me what to do with my seller. Even though in that contract, like Julie says, I said I'd give 3% away, but I didn't, it doesn't say in there, but if they don't want it, who keeps it?
Yeah.
This discussion is coming up with the new, and you all know this, the lawsuit says, if you have a buyer's agent, well, first of all, you can't be working with a buyer without a signed buyer's agency contract. So if you were not signing those until you wrote the offer, change your habits, change your behavior, because you're not legal, if you're not following the lawsuit, the rules of the lawsuit, if you don't have a signed buyer's agency contract. And your buyer's agency contract says, Mr. Buyer, you're hiring me and you're paying me. It's our policy to accept cooperating compensation, but if it's not enough, you gotta pay me. Or if it's a FISBO, you gotta pay me. So if that's not changed. Your buyer was always responsible to pay you. You just have maybe explained it that you don't have to pay me anything. And if you put a 0 in there, you get paid 0. And so if you put 2.5% in there, and I was gonna co-broke 3 with you, you only get to keep 2.5 moving forward. Today, our buyer's agency agreement says you get what I'm offering you. So if there's extra, you get to keep it. So if you only put 2.5 in and I paid you 3, you get to keep 3 today and it's legal. Tomorrow, you can only you're only paid what you put in your buyer's agency contract. You cannot collect more than that. And if the listing agent isn't willing to give you that much, the rest has to come from the buyer, or you have to go back and revise your buyer's agency contract that you'll accept that much so they don't have to pay you. And if you put 2.5 in and you were given 3, you gotta go back and revise it to say, if your buyer will agree, let's revise this, put a 3 in there. So everything has to be completely transparent.
Which is how
God bless you. It's
it always should have been.
exactly. Well, it always, the contract didn't change it who pays him, it's we've been doing it wrong. We're not signing it. The biggest thing is not signing it until you write an offer.
Exactly.
You're afraid to ask the buyer to commit to you. Well, why?
Yeah, you're working for them. You should just like,
And if you don't have it, you're working for nothing.
right.
Everybody deserves to be paid for what you do. This is where, and I know you've done a ton of training on this, you're constantly training, and Adrian and Taylor, your value, just explaining what your value. And there will be an agent out there that will tell them something different and wrong, and you may lose a buyer to somebody like that, but that's just the way it is, so.
And if you're not comfortable, our PC program, that's what it's there for. Like, it's not, a lot of people think that it's new to business and it's just to teach you contracts. That is a teeny tiny portion. It's to help coach you so that way you're confident to have those discussions. And then that's also what our exactly what to say class on Tuesday is all around. It's just helping you feel confident because you need to be able to have those conversations with sellers and buyers because they're both asking. They've been watching the news for the last year, being fed who knows what kind of information about what we're paid for and why we're paid. It's our job to educate them correctly, and have those conversations.
Any questions about that?
Nope, we are good.
Yeah, so then you can talk about how that difference is paid, and if you're still, now this is weird, so you're gonna have an appraisal contingency attached when you're escalating, so. If you want this to win, you can still attach an appraisal contingency saying that if I do escalate, it's gotta appraise. So, and then this does say that if you sign this, it overrides everything in the agreement of sale, but my point is, think about it. If this attachment doesn't get to the lender, and all the lender got was the contract at 400 instead of 450. Now the appraiser's going out with the contract, and when he looks at page 2, he sees a purchase price at 400, and he's paid by the bank to make sure the house is worth at least 400. If you would have changed it to 450, now he's knows he or she has to hit 450. What if they don't see this? Does everybody see the risk to the buyer and to the seller? And you're eliminating an objection when you have an appraisal cut. So use this for negotiations. This is just Gary's opinion. Use this to negotiate, memorialize everything in the agreement of sale. And remember, it's not just changing the price in the agreement of sale, it's changing the mortgage contingency to have the same loan to value ratio at the higher price. Unless your buyer says, I'm gonna bring the extra cash, I still only wanna borrow 400,000. The buyer can still say that. Okay.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Any questions? I know these are the two forms today that we even have, the most experienced agents who they'll still start to question themselves, because once they changed it, was it last year or the year before?
Year before, yeah, in the ACA at the bottom.
That's the
signs
one you
of
read
data
it
at
a
the
second
bottom,
time and you're like,
yeah,
wait a second.
the ACA.
Yeah. But, it trips everybody up. So if you haven't done one in a while and you get stuck, that's what we're here for. Scott will help you as well. He's a great resource. So I'd rather you ask than fill it out wrong.
For sure. So, and have people been winning their offers and getting things through, or?
I just have one tip too. I use it. I always say I default if I'm in like a kind of head to head something. I tend to get good responses when I play dumb. So like with other agents, like, can you just explain that to me a little bit more, just so I can kind of understand the way they're thinking? As far as other brokers having their own version of an escalation or whatever. I just always say my broker requires that we have this one signed, and I never get pushback.
I don't either,
I'm glad that you do that.
because your broker does, I mean,
I'll have my buyers
Your errors
or
and
whoever
omissions.
sign theirs also, but we also need to sign this part one.
Yeah, that's huge.
yeah, your errors and omissions insurance would require you to use, sometimes they won't insure on made up forms, they'll insure on a par form at least. Great, good stuff.
Awesome. This was recorded today. We'll make sure we put it in the need to know. Definitely keep it in your tool belt. So if this comes up and you're like, can't remember, just take the time, watch the video, read the form.
The other thing I forgot to tell you, on every form, you pay dues to PAR, so for every form out there in PAR's library, there's a guide to completing the form that walks you through every paragraph, every sentence. The guide to complete the agreement of sale, and I'm a nerd and I read this kind of stuff, that's, people say, how do you know? I just read. The guide to the agreement of sale is 50-some pages long for filling out 14 pages. It's chock full of practice tips. Chock full. They actually say practice tip, and it gives you all kind of tips. So even if you read a couple pages every day, so for every, I shouldn't say every form, a deposit money notice doesn't need a guide to completing a deposit money form. So the simple forms like non-representation, deposit money, but like your pre and post settlement leases and the seller's property disclosure, they all have guides to complete those forms that are really like the dummy's guide to Windows. I'm quoting my age now, but remember dummy guides? There was the dummy guide to, you're laughing,
Yeah.
you're showing your age. But there were these yellow books that were the dummy's guide to, kind of like Cliff Notes were in college, but so there's a guide to there, she has it. So this is the guide to the agreement of sale. If you click on that, does it tell you how many pages? Like, it's huge.
Yeah,
There, Jennifer has it.
so I took your class at GAR,
Okay,
and I went home and I printed this out.
I'm so proud of you.
Good job.
And how many pages is it?
It was a lot, let me see if it's numbered, 56.
It's at 54, so that's close, yeah. So
We
54.
also send that to all of our buyers before writing an offer for them, like, if you would like to learn.
Oh,
more
wait, now
about
there's a consumer's guide to the.
Right, that's the one we sent.
That's the one you sent. That's another good practice tip, because in the front of that, it has a thing that they acknowledge. So when I teach the class that, is it Jennifer?
Yes.
Yeah, that, you attended, it's all, there it is. It's all based on risk management. So if you use PAR forms, that doesn't mean you couldn't be sued, but your element of risk is so reduced because, well, I didn't understand what I was signing. Well, that's funny because I gave you a guide and you acknowledged receipt of that guide. The fact that you didn't read that guide can't be on my shoulders. Because I tell them, when we're gonna write an offer, I can't go through that contract with you word for word. So start reading this, and it goes through the entire agreement of sale. This is the consumer's guide. She has the realtor's guide.
Yeah, I'll have to see. I couldn't find it in DocuSign, but I think I was typing the wrong thing.
Well, those are on PAR sites, so you wouldn't have those as a form. That wouldn't be a
That
form,
makes sense because they're not signed.
right? So there's all kind of guides there. It probably wouldn't hurt if we created a library of all those guides,
Yeah.
but I would wait till after,
The changes,
yeah,
yeah, we can definitely work on that.
yeah, because those are coming. Two other quick tips, make sure you're going on to these Bright webinars that they're having, they're like 20 minutes on the new fields in Bright starting, it's there now. It'll be mandated August 17th, and PAR is offering training classes. I talked to Brittany about this, and she sent it out in our communications that PAR is gonna go over the new forms. The attorneys at PAR are gonna go over the new forms, so they're gonna offer many sessions, so maybe you can go to every session if you want. I think there's gonna be a, GHR is gonna have a watch party on one of those dates over there. And I'm gonna attend that for questions afterwards. I'm on the task force to get those forms changed with PAR. It's brutal. I sometimes think why, but, it's okay. We go back and forth a lot, trying to anticipate what people are gonna do. Just remember, cooperation is between brokers. A seller can still cooperate with another broker. You just can't put that in the MLS. So now when I show Julie's listing, I gotta call Julie or Julie and say, I'm showing 123 Main Street. How much are you willing to pay me? I think what's gonna happen is everybody's gonna look at that concession field and say, oh, that's the new VAC field. Cooperating broker compensation is not seller concession. Seller concessions can be used to pay a buyer's agent, because who's responsible to pay their buyer's agent? Buyer. So when you're doing your buyer's cost sheet from now on, you better be putting in the fee that they owe you based on that agreement. So that becomes one of their closing costs. Then you're gonna have another number underneath that, seller concessions, and a blank negative, because you don't know yet. But in the agreement of sale, or through a CBC form, co-op broker form, that probably your buyer's gonna sign now to show that you got paid what you know more than what you said you charged them. So you just have to rethink how we're doing business and how we're saying the words. Co-op compensation is not concessions. So don't just take all your listings and put your VAC field into concessions. That's not what it's there for. There's fear that if you just put a yes and no amount, when it goes on to the public sites, will buyers not want to see houses where the seller's not offering any concessions because they're thinking they're not going to pay their buyer's agent? So you don't want your listings not to be shown. So there's just a ton of stuff we anticipate we'll lose about 20%, 15 to 20% of agents, because they're just not gonna deal with it, which is sad. But it's not hard. This business changes all the time. So.
For sure, and I'd like to remind people that the mortgage industry went through.
Exactly.
This changes.
Exactly.
after the crash, and the folks who showed value and did their job right, like they're still here.
They're still here, yeah.
Yeah.
Focus on service and the money will come. I can't preach that enough. People say, why were you successful? I don't do what I used to do. After 31 years, I don't want to do that volume. But I just focus on service and the money comes. Because if you focus on service, what happens? You get what? Starts with an R. Referrals. Easiest way to make money, referrals. Just do a good job. Somebody with them, when they hear the word realtor, call Brittany. She did a great job for us. She'll do a great job for you. And after maybe 3 to 5 years, it'll just flow. So it'll be fine. And you're right. That's a good example. The mortgage industry, believe me, even though these changes are big, it's nothing that the mortgage industry went through. And that was all government mandated too.
Yeah.
But the DOJ will be watching us, so don't try to do trickery, whatever you do. Don't think you can put stuff in associated documents. You can't put stuff on showing time, what you're willing to offer. Just pick up the phone and call the other agent. If it's one more step. But somebody was saying, we'll put pillows in the listing that have a 3 on them. And then you'll see in one of the pictures on the multi-list that we're offering 3% by a pillow with the number 3 on the couch. Are you kidding me? You're still using the multi-list some people are gonna have cooperating broker compensation forms signed and sitting in the listing. That would be okay. So people are coming up with all kinds of creative ideas to let other agents know what they're willing to co-broke with them. There's just concern that what do you put in the multi-list?
But you know, it's funny, like, if you're gonna write an offer, you should be calling the list agent anyway. Like,
I was gonna say, all this stuff, putting a sheet in the house is great, but
Oh, I'm not gonna
if you
do
wanna
it.
show the home, like, you should. All I've heard you say all day is communicate with the other agent.
Yes, communicate,
Just all
right.
communicate.
But see, that's what's lost. Before, when I'm a dinosaur, 31 years ago, you brought the contract. If I sold Brittany's listing, I brought her a stack of papers with a check. And handed it to her and went over to her. In the day, she would have us all lined outside of the conference room and we go in and present our offers to her seller in the office, in a conference room. And that's why we changed the contract to say deposit monies are due 5 days, because until we put that in there and we started faxing contracts, we technically were violating immediately because the contract said a check with this offer. And we were scanning and faxing them, and there was no check with that offer. So we had to figure out, well, we've changed the way we do business, so we have to change the contract, so we're not out of compliance from the beginning, and that's when we put the 5 days. That's why we did it, because we stopped hand carrying offers, yeah, so.
now I get made fun of by Caleb when I had to use the fax machine the other day. He was like, what is that sound?
Yeah, well, we've learned to communicate by text message, and it's not bad, but we can't constantly, and she gives me permission to use her name. Try to text Angie Miller a real estate question. It's not gonna happen. She's not gonna respond to you. She'll say, I do not text real estate. She runs everything in an email, and that's brilliant, because everything now is documented. Unless you're typing up your text messages, they're not documented, so, they're really not. But we do it just because it's easy and it's quick and it's convenient.
Well, that's the way some people will only communicate via text message. You can't get them on the phone,
Right,
and that's a shame.
Yes,
yeah,
yeah.
so we'll be fine. You'll get through this. It's not gonna be that hard. It's just, it's just rethinking the way we've always done stuff. So it's evolution. You'll be fine. You'll be fine.
100%.
But I think, it's just gonna take a while, and the forms will change, because we don't know what to expect practice-wise, so they'll change a couple times until we get it right, but we have to come out with the forms that will come out will be compliant with the lawsuit, I guarantee you that. They have what the lawsuit says we have to have in them. The way we use them is gonna be a little, just an education.
For sure.
We always have anything else, guys? It's a little bit more than you needed, but hopefully.
Good stuff. Thank you.
You can have like a situation,
Sure, okay,
if I could do it one-on-one.
sure, that's fine, yeah, let me just throw this in. Thank you.
Turn off the recording.
We can't really say, I don't, we think we're gonna get fired off, but that's what we have to put that item set in my office, still do it.
Yeah.
We'll change it as we want it. But I mean, that's the hard thing. Not having a full picture of,
I'm on 13.
Oh,
Yeah, this is Jenny.
I'm Jenny.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.